Civilizations do not usually end suddenly. They fade slowly, over decades or even centuries, as systems that once worked begin to fail. The reasons are rarely dramatic. More often, decline happens through quiet erosion, small problems that grow larger, institutions that lose effectiveness, and societies that cannot adapt quickly enough to changing conditions. Throughout history, many complex societies have declined, not because of a single catastrophe, but because multiple pressures accumulated over time. Understanding these patterns requires looking beyond kings and battles, focusing instead on the underlying structures that keep civilizations functioning. One of the most common factors in civilizational decline is environmental pressure. Societies depend on stable access to resources, water, fertile soil, timber, and food. When these resources become scarce or unpredictable, the foundation of daily life begins to weaken. Evidence indicates that several ancient civilizations experienced prolonged droughts or shifts in climate that disrupted agriculture. Crops failed more frequently. Harvests became less reliable. In regions where populations had grown large, even small reductions in food production created serious strain. As agricultural output declined, food became more expensive. Communities that had once thrived faced shortages. Trade networks, which depended on surplus production, began to contract. Without abundant food, populations could not be sustained at previous levels. Economic strain often follows environmental decline. When agricultural surplus decreases, tax revenues fall. Governments depend on taxation to maintain infrastructure, pay administrators, and support public works. When income declines, these services deteriorate. Historians suggest that many civilizations struggled to maintain roads, irrigation systems, and defensive structures as their economies weakened. Without regular maintenance, infrastructure degraded, wells silted up, canals became clogged, roads fell into disrepair. These failures compounded existing problems, making recovery even more difficult. Social imbalance also contributed to decline. In many societies, wealth became increasingly concentrated among elites, while the majority faced worsening conditions. This imbalance created tension and reduced social cohesion. Research points to patterns where ruling classes maintained their privileges even as the broader population suffered. As resources became scarce, elites often protected their own interests, sometimes at the expense of the common good. This behavior eroded trust in leadership and weakened the bonds that held society together. Administrative complexity presented another challenge. As civilizations grew larger, their governments became more elaborate. Bureaucracies expanded, regulations multiplied. The cost of administration increased steadily. Over time, the burden of supporting these complex systems became difficult to sustain, especially when economic conditions deteriorated. Governments required more resources simply to function, leaving less available for investment in infrastructure or responding to crises. Evidence indicates that some civilizations reached a point where administrative costs outweighed the benefits of centralized control. Local populations found it harder to justify supporting distant bureaucracies that provided diminishing returns. Compliance with central authority weakened. Loss of adaptability played a critical role in many declines. Civilizations are built on specific strategies, particular crops, trade routes, technologies, or social arrangements. These strategies work well under certain conditions, but when conditions change, inflexibility becomes dangerous. Societies that had specialized heavily in specific economic activities found it difficult to adjust when those activities became less viable. Communities dependent on particular trade goods struggled when trade networks shifted. Agricultural societies tied to specific crops faced severe challenges when climate patterns changed. Historians suggest that the ability to innovate and adapt determined whether societies could navigate periods of stress. Those that clung rigidly to old methods often fared worse than those willing to experiment with new approaches. Migration and demographic shifts also influenced decline. As conditions worsened in certain regions, populations moved in search of better opportunities. This movement placed pressure on neighboring areas and disrupted established patterns of settlement and production. In some cases, migration brought new populations into contact with established communities, creating competition for resources and altering social dynamics. These changes could destabilize existing arrangements and contribute to broader patterns of decline. Disease occasionally played a role, though its impact varied. Epidemics could reduce populations suddenly, disrupting labor forces and economic production. However, disease alone rarely caused complete collapse. More often, it acted as one stress among many, weakening societies already facing other challenges. The interaction of multiple factors made decline difficult to reverse. Environmental problems reduced agricultural output, which decreased tax revenue, which limited infrastructure maintenance, which further reduced productivity. Each problem reinforced the others in a downward cycle. Breaking such cycles required resources, coordination, and effective leadership. In societies where institutions had weakened and social trust had eroded, mobilizing collective action became extremely difficult. Communities became fragmented, focused on immediate survival rather than long-term solutions. Archaeological evidence shows that many civilizations experienced prolonged periods of decline during which urban centers shrank, monumental construction ceased, and written records became less frequent. These changes occurred gradually, sometimes over generations. People living through such declines may not have recognized the broader pattern. Each year might have seemed only slightly worse than the last. The cumulative effect only becomes clear when viewed across decades or centuries. It is important to note that decline did not mean the disappearance of people or culture. Populations often persisted, but the complex political and economic structures that had defined the civilization dissolved. People adapted to simpler, more localized forms of organization. In many cases, knowledge and cultural traditions survived in modified forms, carried forward by descendant communities or absorbed by successor societies. Decline marked the end of particular political systems, not necessarily the end of the people who had lived within them. The study of civilizational decline reveals that complexity itself can become a vulnerability. Systems that grow intricate and interdependent become fragile when faced with disruption. The same specialization and organization that create prosperity during stable periods can become liabilities when conditions change. Understanding these patterns offers perspective on how societies function and what makes them resilient or fragile. The lessons are not about specific events, but about underlying dynamics. How environmental limits, economic pressures, social structures, and institutional effectiveness interact over time. No single factor alone determines a civilization's fate. Decline results from the accumulation of many stresses, each manageable in isolation but overwhelming in combination. This gradual process, rather than sudden catastrophe, characterizes most historical examples of civilizational failure. The archaeological and historical record shows that civilizations declined when they could no longer maintain the complex systems upon which they depended. Resources became insufficient, institutions lost effectiveness, and societies fragmented under accumulated pressures. These processes unfolded slowly, often across multiple generations, making them difficult to recognize and address at the time. While uncertainty remains about specific details, In many cases, the broader pattern is clear. Civilizations fail not from single blows, but from the slow erosion of the foundations that once sustained them.